come up in a minute. So is recording started?
Yes, the recording started. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Diana. Okay, this session. Okay, I've gone too far. Actually, we'll go back to the beginning. Excellent. Right. So this session is about explaining the scope of one of my favorite exams, which is the Power Platform Developer, the PL-400 exam, which is aimed at developers. So I'm going to review what the exam is. I'm going to explain what the objectives listed in the exam are actually mean, and try and direct you to some resources as well, and including some videos, which somebody asked about at the end of the session. I'll put you some blogs and some really good videos which cover this exam and really help you prepare for success. The worst thing, whenever you look at the exam, it's really hard to know how deep do you go. What do I need to cover before I go in? And that's what I'm going to try and help you with today. My name is Julian Sharp, and I've been involved in Dynamics since it first came out. But for the last 2-3 years, all I've been doing is Power Platform, along with a bit of Dynamics, and often with Azure to create solutions. I don't count myself as a developer, but I write code. And I use code in my solutions. Because I used to be a developer originally. I used to write Fortran, but a long time ago, I used to do complex modeling of 3D surfaces. So I still do some development, but I do a bit of everything else as well. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I spend a lot of my time training people. I'm a 1-year MVP. And you'll see my Twitter handle there, Julian Dynamics, and my LinkedIn account as well. So for those who asked about that, that's where it is. That's where you can find me. So if you want to connect to me, do so now. So what we're going to explain what the developer role is, the Power Platform developer role, because I think the Power Platform developer isn't the developer role as far as Microsoft sees it isn't what you classically call a developer. It's developing within the Power Platform. You may use developer techniques, but I think it's wider than just being a developer. So we'll look at what that is. We'll then effectively go through the exam objective domain, and we will then give you some resources on how to prepare. Yeah, Fortran, go. Fortran 77. And Pascal and others as well. Right, let's go. So let's define the role of developer in terms of this certification. What does Microsoft do? And this is the blurb that Microsoft has. And I'm not going to read it out to you. You can read it. There's a lot of technologies in there. JSON, JavaScript, RESTful Web Services, ASP.NET, Power BI. Actually, I think all of those probably apply apart from ASP.NET. No, actually, I was taught COBOL. My first job, they put me on a 8-week COBOL course, but I never actually used it in practice. I went straight to 4GLs and other things. So this is what Microsoft says, and there's a lot of things in there. This is what I think this exam is targeted at. It's targeted at building, and this is something you need to be aware of. It's not just code-first solutions or code-first approaches. It's also low-code or no-code approaches. You need, as a Power Platform developer, to be able to do both no-code, i.e. Canvas apps, and create apps like that, and use model-driven apps, and use all those other low-code tools that are available in the Power Platform, but also write code as well, both front-end and back-end. Be able to do integration by leveraging Azure services, but you also have to have a deep understanding. This is when you talk about Power Platform. Some people think, oh, it's about SharePoint or other products. No, it's really about Dataverse. It's a Dataverse exam, using Dataverse as a platform for building solutions. So you have to have deep understanding, not just of all Dataverse capabilities, but how they work. You're going to be asked to compare, when should I take a particular approach? What's the difference between a business rule and Power Automate flow? So how do those operate? So you need to understand how they actually work. So that's for me, this is what I think. So if you're coming in and you, for instance, I think it's possible if somebody's a functional consultant to maybe pass this exam. I don't think that's designed because there's a fair amount of low code stuff in there. They might be able to guess some of the others. but you really need to do some coding, I think. And the exam has got harder from when it first came out. You may have seen some people post, I passed it in beta and I passed it early on. No, the exam has been tightened up since it first came out. Right, so what's in the scope of the exam? And I've nicked a couple of slides from the Microsoft site. We'll move on. So what this says is, ideally, it says ideal candidates develop a strong applied knowledge of Power Platform service. And I think that's actually right. You need to have actually done something. It's not just a matter of having read it, it's the applied knowledge of the Power Platform. So I'm going to put this link in the chat if I can, if it'll let me paste. This is where you go find this page. Let's see if it will work. Allow me to type it in. Yeah. You should be able to go there. Yeah, that's I posted a link where you can go find this sort of information. Okay, and it's Microsoft has different types of exam. We've got fundamentals. Actually, sorry, the link's actually up on the top of the page. So I didn't see it. And this is what we call an associate level. It's so we have fundamentals, associate, and expert. However, I think this is on the harder side of the associate level exams. So when we look at role-based exams, Microsoft role-based exams, they typically have around 40 to 60 questions. You will have a number of different questions up, so I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And you will have case studies, one or more case studies. We currently do not have performance-based labs. Performance-based labs are where you're actually told, you're given a scenario and asked to actually, you're put into a live system and asked to do something. You will also have to interpret code. You'll be given it's a developer exam, so you'll be given what does this code do, or what do I need to do to fix this code, or what happens if this code runs, sort of thing. So you need to have seen code questions. So although it says 150 minutes to answer questions, that's only true if you have performance-based labs. It's 130 minutes if there aren't any labs. So, but it's plenty of time. You never run out of time on these exams. For me, I tend to be quite quick on them, and then I've taken about 100 of them now. Now, Microsoft changed the focus of the exams. They tried to increase the cognitive level, and this exam shows this, where it's not about what you know, which is the understand and remembering. It's understand and remembering a low cognitive level. It's about recall of facts, or maybe you may see the word describe, or be able to select it from a list, be able to work out which one it is, be able to say what its capabilities. Here it's very much at the apply and analyze level. And some are probably at the evaluate level, where you have to maybe apply knowledge from multiple things together. It's not just one thing. There'll be 2 or 3 concepts in here. As I said, maybe comparing business rules to Power Automate Flow to plugins, which means you need to understand how those work and then analyze or maybe evaluate when I should use those. So it's a much higher cognitive level. And we have a number of different types of question available to us. If you've not taken the Microsoft exam before, this can be quite surprising. There's about half the question what they call, half about multiple choice, and the half are all these other types, such as drag and drop, or you will get graphic interpretation. Graphic interpretation will give you screenshots and multiple screenshots, and you have to try and work out, you'll then get asked a question where you have to go look at those screenshots and see what's happened. Or multi-source reasoning, again, it may be different exhibits you have to look at and try and figure things out. And you will get a case study. Pretty sure there's a case study in these, maybe 1, maybe 2, where you get a lot of information you have to read through and then get around 4 to 6 questions on that scenario that you're given. And there's a lot of reading. You'll typically get like here's an overview, here's the current system, here's the requirements, here's the issues. And you have to read a lot to work out what to do and answer those questions. And as I said, there are expect to see code listed out where you're given like 20, 30 lines of code, and you have to understand what that code is doing and be able to then answer questions on it. You maybe ask 2 or 3 questions on that piece of code. So it's code interpretation. And when questions are written, they're written like this. If you've never seen one before, typically they're made up of 4 parts. You don't have to have all 4, but you generally have the bottom 2. You'll either have, you are a developer implementing a Power Platform solution to integrate with a third-party solution. You need to be able to authenticate to that system. So you get something like this, and then how should you do that, or what should you do? And then that answers the question. The question statement is always the answer. The goal statement is what you're focused on. What do I need to do? And this is the question statement is how you have to answer it. So I'm trying to read the questions. Now, in the past, I used to write lots and lots of text. So you used to get like paragraphs at the beginning of the technical scenario. They've pretty much dropped that now. They're quite short, so you don't have to spend lots of time reading and try and catch you up. But there's a really good video on my YouTube channel. I put it up at the end from one of the guy at Microsoft who explained how questions are written and why sometimes you get lots of there'll be something in the question somewhere in the problem statement, which is there'll be some word in there which is designed to make one of the answers completely incorrect. And he's got a really good example, and he uses the Lord of the Rings on how to create how something a simple question ends up being quite complicated, and why some words there are there just to exclude certain answers, which we call them distractors, the wrong answers. So that's the big question. I'll put the link to my YouTube channel in a minute, because I ran an event called Certification Saturday back in, well, it wasn't that long ago actually, back in March or beginning of April, where we actually had that. And there was a few sessions. Unfortunately, we didn't have a session on this exam, which is why I'm doing it now. So let's have a look at the exam objectives. There are actually 7 objectives. This is a very, very broad exam. And you see there, we've got 7, the way Microsoft calls them, they have what they call an objective domain, which is what the scope of the exam is. And we've got 7 main objectives, which is rather a lot for an exam. Typically, you look at some of the exams, there's some 3 or 4 mainly, but here we've got 7. So there's a lot of information to cover. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these different areas. You notice that some of them are worth less than others. Development integration is 5 to 10%, but I don't always trust these percentages, because sometimes when you have exam questions, you may get a slightly different variation. This is in general. You may get slightly more questions in one of the areas than the others than this. And also some questions can end up crossing multiple objectives. So it's basically broad. That's what I'm saying. And that means there's a lot to learn. And it covers both. We're going to look at design, we're going to look at Dataverse, we're going to look at Power Apps, we're going to look at front-end code, we're going to look at back-end code, APIs, and integration with Azure. So very, very broad. The first bits are really, which we're going to dive into now. Let's look about what these are. So create a technical design. I'm not going to go massively into these. I'm just going to explain what I think these are. So creating a technical design. This is really about understanding what you can do with the Power Platform. This is about comparing between the different components or different ways of doing things. So this is really about evaluating which should I use. When it says design solution components, what does that mean? So I'm going to go through that now. So validate requirements and design technical architecture. What does that include? Okay, because it's 10 to 15%, we've got around 50 questions. So that's maybe 4 to 7 questions on what I'm going to describe here. Just roughly you'll get on this, but it may be not, because you may have a case studies. Case studies will span the entire set of objectives. I have one case study, I can have questions from anywhere. So let's have a look. So design and validate the technical architecture for a solution. So this includes things like authentication and authorization strategies, which if you watch the last session from Ty, she talked about setting up an Azure AD user, so you can use that to integrate with. So that includes, you need to have knowledge of that sort of thing. How do I manage my integrations? Well, I'm going to want to create an application user. What do I do for that? How do I go for that? How do I then authorize my users? Also have a bit of understanding what you can do out of the box as well. And again, that's really important from a developer. You shouldn't just go and rebuild something if something is there. You need to be able to compare when to use logic apps in Azure versus Power Automate flows. So you need to have an awareness of the different capabilities. When would I use one over the other? When I'm going to use Azure Functions, we'll talk about Azure Functions later on, and I'm a big fan. So I've got a choice when I do back-end processing. I can use Azure Functions, I can use plugins, I can use Power Automate. What are the pros and cons of each of those? That's what it's really getting into here at the beginning. Also things like virtual tables. If you're going to use Dataverse, virtual tables are becoming more and more important as a way of bringing data into Dataverse and into apps without actually having to move the data from its original data store. So you need to know those. As a developer has to get involved because they have to write the data connector. They have to write code for that. So you need to know what the, virtual tables can do, what they can't do. So when would I use a virtual table versus when would I use a connector? And that depends on what I'm doing. I'm not going to give you the answers. I'm just saying this is the scope of you need to be able to have an idea about those. If I'm saying something like virtual tables and you don't know what it is, you need to go and read up on that. And there's loads of documentation. I'm going to give the stuff later. Now it might not be in Learn, but it'll be in the Microsoft Docs. Microsoft Docs is your friend here. So designing solution components, what does that mean? It means building a data model. Okay, you need to understand data modeling. You need to understand tables and relationships. You need to understand when would I use a lookup table? When would I have a table and do a lookup? Or when would I use what's now called a choice, or used to be called an option set, which used to be called what did it used to be called? It used to be called a pick list or a menu item. So when would I use those, and what's the pros and cons? And then that brings in things like localization. You need to understand if I'm building a multi-country or multi-language system, multi-currency system, what impact does that have on my design choices? It also includes reusable components. So when would I use a PCF? And we've got a whole section on PCF. When would I use PCF? When would I use component libraries? The designing of those. Maybe even, it also includes designing custom connectors as well. Custom connectors come in here. So there's a lot of, behind these words, there's a lot of things coming in. And then when I describe the extensibility points, it's the different ways I can extend my different things. So this is using Azure, but it's not just calling from Dataverse out to Azure, which is again covered later on. But it's also included how do I extend Power Virtual Agents? So if you don't know Power Virtual Agents, there's two ways we can extend PVAs, and that's one's with skills, which allows us to run bots created with the Azure Bot Framework, and also we can use Power Automate flows as extensibility points. For Power BI, remember this isn't just, it's Power Platform, so it does include Power BI, but from a developer perspective, and Power BI has a couple of separate APIs. It's got an administrative API to allow you to administer workspace and other things, and then it's got a program API which allows you to maybe do refreshes of data or push data into Power BI. Also, how can I embed all our different components together? Embedding Power BI in model analysis, embedding Power BI in portals, embedding Canvas in model. All of those things come into play here when I talk about extensibility points, as well as extending Dataverse with plugins or using the APIs. So it's describing all of that. So those 10 to 15%, this is a big subject all its own. And when I normally teach this, this is normally my summary bit, because you've covered all we do in terms of what we can do, the components. And this is really how do I use this together? How do I really build something? What are my choices? So this is really, when we go back to that Bloom's taxonomy, this is the evaluate and assess and choose. And I'm to go compare things. So this is quite high level of knowledge and application. If you have any questions, ask in the chat or stick your hand up and I'll ask it. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end. But if you have any questions, write them in the chat and I'll try and answer them as we go through. Right, the second objective, so I'm not going to spend ages on each one because we've got 7, there's lots of them. We've only got I've been going 20 minutes already. So let's look at the next one. It's configure Dataverse. It's only got three sub-objectives. Configure security to support development. What does that mean? Implement tables and columns and implement lifecycle management. So configuring security support. This means a good understanding of security. It's not, I think this is taken to be much more than support development. It's actually support the actual live system. So you need to have a really, really good understanding of the Dataverse security model. So it's security roles, business units, teams, field level security or column level security. It's interesting, it's field level security, it's column level security, but then we create field security profiles still. So understanding about field security profiles is in there. How do I create a field security profile? How do I use that? How do I configure business units? How do I configure teams as well? And it's becoming more important now into teams using, rather than creating users, we actually can create, a team that's based on an Azure AD group. And therefore, to add users, we just add them to the Azure AD group. You need to understand how that works. So that's really the way we should be deploying our users now in Dataverse. So we need to have a good understanding of the tables and columns, and not from this is a lot more detailed. So if you're doing like the PL-200, you just need to know the basic options. I create tables, I add columns, the data types. Here, we need to understand all the options, because a lot of the options, such as in adding an email, checking the email box on the table properties, or checking the connections, what does that actually do? You need to have an understanding. And when we get into the columns, you really need to understand calculated fields or calculated columns and roll-up columns and auto number columns. You need to understand how they work, when they get updated. So for instance, calculated columns are calculated when you read a record. So if a user's doing it on a form, they don't see the calculation until you hit save. Roll-up fields are only rolled up every hour. But if you didn't know, there's an API call to actually force that refresh. So, okay, some good questions. I'm going to answer both of those at the end, because they're the sort of, knowing the limits is actually one of the things that you need to know. What are the limits for APIs and importing and exporting records? Yes, and knowing the API limits come in here as well. I'm not going to go into when you should use virtual or custom connecting. I could spend an hour just on that alone. And somebody else's question about MB400 and PL-400. Yes, it was a renaming. So the MB400 was effectively renamed. Most of the questions were carried through. There was a few, there'd been more questions added since. I think it's a slightly harder exam than the MB400, but it covers exactly the same material. And I'll answer it at the end, that limits. So I'm not going to answer detailed questions. I haven't got time to do everything else. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Okay, the other thing you need to know, which isn't mentioned here, is the relationships. You need to understand how one-to-many and many-to-many relationships work. You need to understand the behaviors. So the cascade behaviors, when you assign or share or delete records, how does that work? You need to understand mappings, when they're applied. When we come to the lifecycle management, you need to understand DevOps. So this actually covers a number of things. It covers solutions, so managed and unmanaged solutions, importing and exporting of solutions, solution dependencies, solution layers, package manager, so package manager, the configuration manager, which allows you to move data between things. You also then need to understand how we automate with Azure DevOps. You need to go through and understand the process for source code control and the DevOps pipelines. So large amounts of subject. And this is probably one of the biggest subjects in the exam. I felt it was a very deep exam around Dataverse. The other really big topic is just building apps. And this is no code. This is where some people get stuck. I'm a developer. I haven't built many Canvas apps. There are a lot of detailed questions. So compared to, say, the PL-200, which is the book I wrote, which talks about building apps, but it builds them very simply. You don't really need to know very much apart from what's used. Here, you need to have a really good understanding of how things work with these apps. So it's a little bit, it's deeper, especially in Canvas apps. you're going to be, so let me talk about monitoring apps. It's about building the apps. It's about the security aspects on the thing. So how do I link security roles to forms, to views, to dashboards? How do I configure visualizations? How does business process flows interact, especially because business process flows create a table? How do you handle that? And what's that useful for? When you get into Canvas apps, it isn't just building the apps and galleries. It's about complex formulas. You're going to be expected to know how to use complex formulas to manage events and properties. How to use application insights. So, for instance, you can embed application insights, which is an Azure service, within a Canvas app to track telemetry. You need to know how to do that. You need to know about building reusable components and component libraries and how to test it using Test Studio. And then we've also got to understand how to use everything within Microsoft Teams, the different ways to take an app and add it to a channel or to go and build that within Teams. There's also, this is a very common theme throughout the exam. This one's actually pulled out, but troubleshooting. How do I solve problems? This could be in performance things or monitoring. How do I monitor for problems? How do I spot performance problems? So this is things like the app checker and solution checker and understanding what the outputs of those are. We actually run a 5-day course for this, and I don't think 5-day course is enough. What other debugging tools do I have? So anybody, if I'm building a Canvas app, what are my debugger tools? Anybody want to write in the chat? Or a model of that, or if especially I'm writing PCF, what am I going to use to debug my apps? So you need to know the various different tools, and including things like XRM Toolbox comes in here. The community tools come in here as well. So I'm actually talking here about Fiddler, understanding that if you've never used Fiddler, you need to do that, because that allows you to see what's going on between on the client. You need to resolve errors in the APIs or in connectors. You need to optimizing for performance comes in here. So you need to understand what's good and bad. You need to understand query delegation, that sort of thing. So it's and this is where a lot of developers, I think, struggle, who've never really got building the low-code apps, because it isn't just a simple, oh, how do I build an app? That's straightforward. A lot of the training is very simple. You actually have to really build them. This is, you need to have, I thought, it's applied knowledge where you've actually had to build an app that's deployed and understand performance issues. So monitor comes in here as well. Yes, you'd use the monitor feature to check what's going on within your app. So debugging with monitor, but also you might have to use Fiddler when you come to things like PCF. And I use Fiddler as well. Right, this third objective is quite small. It's only 5 to 10%, but it's incredibly important. It's probably one of the hardest things to do. So it's about Power Automate, and it's right now it's only Power Automate cloud flows and business process flows. It's not Power Automate desktop yet. I expect that to come in later, but right now it's just the cloud flows. And so what we've got in here, oh no, I've gone past it. So this is quite short. So it's about understanding the basics about cloud flows. It's the steps and actions and triggers, and understanding the different types of triggers. Where would you use an instant trigger versus a scheduled trigger versus an automated trigger? How do you do complex expressions? So this is understanding, maybe I don't know the scope of this in the exam. So how would I do, maybe how would I compare two dates, for instance? You have to use ticks. For instance, I was teaching this yesterday. How do you handle error handling? So right now, if you just build an app, how do I handle if an error? What do I do? Because if you're a developer, you're expected to be able to handle more than a functional consultant who basically just assumes everything's going to go well. If you're a developer, you know, I always call it defensive coding. You always have to trap your errors and decide what to do with them. And that applies to Power Automate Flow as well. So it's all the error handling, troubleshooting, where do you go, how do you rerun things, and actually having a look at, and if you don't know, Power Automate, when it generates, everything's a web API call. It's all the REST APIs, and it's getting JSON back. So it's understanding how to look at the JSON and parse the JSON in there. Where would I go for that in a Power Automate flow? Implement processes covers a wide range of things. It's business process flows, so building those, is not mentioned. Business rules, which are incredibly important. If there's one thing I'm going to tell you to learn, business rules will come up, definitely. They like to ask questions around that. Understand, especially with business rules. Business rules have different ways they apply. They can be applied for model-driven app forms. They can also be applied at the entity level scope, which means they run on the server. So how does business rules work with Canvas apps? How do business rules work with portal apps? And if you don't know, go build it. The best thing to do is go see what happens and how they're handled. So what happens if I have like a business rule that effectively does show error? What do I see in my Canvas app? And how do I handle that in the Canvas app? Business. So also we get into here. How do I interact with my processes on the front client side and the server side? So maybe JavaScript interacting with my business process flow. So client side scripting comes in here, which we're going to talk about in the next section. And then just troubleshoot if things go wrong. It's troubleshooting, debugging comes up all the way through this. So although it's only 5 to 10%, I think this is probably one of the harder areas. You have to be able to compare when do I use business rules versus Power Automate flows, versus cloud flows versus classic. And also classic workflow comes in here, which again, you may not have been exposed to depending where you're coming from. So classic workflow is the old Dynamics workflow, but you can still use it within the Power Platform, within Dataverse. And it does have some benefits. For instance, you can do classic workflow synchronous, whereas Power Automate's always asynchronous. Okay, fourth objective is extend the user experience. So this is scripting. This is client-side blending. I'm going to spend the three major objectives. The first one is using client-side scripting, which is using JavaScript or TypeScript, and the next session is going to be all about TypeScript. So targeting the client API. So the things I can do, especially in a model-driven app form, to manipulate the user interface at runtime. So there's two sides to this. There's client-side scripting with the client API, what used to be called the XRM API model, to manipulate tabs, sections, and fields. And this is where you actually then start comparing it with business rules. What can business rules do? Because business rules are actually implemented in the form as JavaScript. That's how Microsoft actually does it. But there are some pros and cons on those. For instance, business rules business rules, how to describe it, can only do certain things. They can only access on columns. They can't access on tabs or sections. So I can't hide whole tabs or sections, which I can with client-side script. Also, with client-side script, I can do web API calls to go get data and do other things outside of the scope of the record that I'm on the form with. We've got event handlers, so you need to understand the onload, the onsave, and how they work. You can also register event handlers on the fly. So you need to understand about things like namespaces and naming of your client-side scripts and how the process of getting client-side scripts in using web resources. So, and as well, then how do I call the Dataverse web API to read and write data? PCF, big subject. If you haven't done PCF at all, you will fail every single question. If you've not built a Power Apps component, code component, and been through that process, you will not be able to answer any of these questions, because you need to understand how they're made up of. You need to understand the steps you have to go through to build them. You need to understand the manifest file. So you need to understand what goes in the manifest file. So if you want to know that, come to my talk in just over an hour and I'll go through the manifest file. You also need to know the 4 methods that we have, the 4 standard methods: init, get outputs, update, view, and destroy. You need to know why they're used. You need to know how to pass information to and from the form you're in. So how do I interact with the form that I put the control on when I do it? So you need to, so how do you define the interfaces, and then how do you package and deploy and consume the component? How do you also use get my component to use maybe the device's resources or the web API, how to test it. This is probably, I think, one of the more complex ones, and it's it's very easy to write questions for that are difficult to answer. Command function is all about the ribbon diff XML, and using the ribbon workbench. And actually, the courseware calls out ribbon workbench. So if you've never used ribbon workbench, you need to understand that a little, but you also need to understand the structure. So you need to understand if I want to add a button, it's a command button. The command button has display rules and enable rules. It also has the command, which is can be linked to a JavaScript, which has to have a web resource. So you need to understand the command function and how they're all actually linked together. So it's conceptual, how they all apply command, display rules, enable rules, and actions, and how to do it in the ribbon workbench, and how to manage dependencies between JavaScript libraries. Okay, how long we got? Okay, I'm going to try and leave some time at the end, so I'm just going to go through this. Now, this is where most Dataverse developers will be most comfortable, in plugins. So plugins stand away. If you've been around Dynamics for a while, most developers know how to create a plugin. But for me, you need to understand the execution pipeline. So you need to understand where you can put a plugin with pre-plugin, post-plugin, pre or post. You need to understand the difference between pre-validation and pre. What's it? I can't remember off the top of my head. You need to understand how to debug a plugin. You also need to understand about images, pre and post images, and when you'd use those. You're going to get asked about performance and troubleshooting. How do I make sure I don't write plugins that don't perform well? Which is making sure I only fire my plugin on updated. I don't select all attributes. I use images to reduce the number of queries. Remember, plugins have only got a 2-minute hard limit. That's something else you need to know. And so what do I do if my plugin is going to take longer than 2 minutes? You also need to understand the organization API, because plugins still use the organization API. How do I do that? So that's things like retrieve multiple. And how can I use plugins with custom actions as well? Or now the custom API, as we've got. Custom connectors, you need to understand the process you go through. You need to understand the security around them. Policy templates to modify behavior at runtime. How to expose an Azure function as a custom connector. I'm actually giving you a talk on that next Saturday. So if you want to find out about how to use Azure functions as custom connectors, that's the talk next Saturday that I'm giving. And how to connect to public APIs using things like Postman. Platform APIs, this is the web API and the organization service. So in here, you need to understand about limits. What happens if I hit the API limits? There's also difference. We've got service limits and individual limits, and you need to understand the difference between the two. You also need to how to handle retries, because you get, I think it's error 429 you get if you've got you've got to hit the limit, you need to retry. What do you do? How do we design for concurrency and performance? And this comes into things like change tracking, using batch transactions or multiple transactions at once. How to use the discovery service comes up. And also how to do metadata operations. So metadata operations is like create a table, create a column with an API call. How to use, and also you need to understand how to authenticate with OAuth. So process workloads comes into this thing where I've got something that's going to take longer than 2 minutes in a plugin. So this is where we start looking at Azure functions. So using Azure functions to do longer running. How do I call those? How do I set them up? Do I do a webhook, or do I use a service bus? How do I create Azure functions? So at this point, you actually need to create Azure functions. You need to understand maybe how do I trigger function, maybe from a webhook, or maybe I have an Azure function running on a schedule. And how do I authenticate back from my Azure function back into my Dataverse? using service principals and managed identity. This is where that the last session we talked about creating an Azure AD user to do that management. This is where that comes in. I think this is the final section. Develop integration. There's a bit of an overlap, which is what I just described using Azure. This is where the Azure really comes in. So you need to understand how we can publish events from Dataverse. So Dataverse has the ability to publish events into the Azure Service Bus, into the Azure Event Hub, or to call webhooks. So, and how that works both with a no-code way and a code way. So you can publish, how do I create an event and call it? And then how can I consume it? So it's about registering the service endpoint, which is a service bus or event hub, or what's the actual process of what do I need for a webhook to integrate it? And then how do I listen for events on service bus or create an Azure function to create a webhook to listen to it? So you need to create an Azure, you must be able to go create an Azure function that interacts either with an event or a webhook. Although it's only 5 to 10%, this is again for people who've not been exposed to Azure. This can be pretty difficult. And then the final one, data synchronization, is things like change tracking. How do I do that? And then how do I do it in code? So change tracking allows you to get all the, if you don't know, it allows you to get all the changes since you last asked. And there's a little token you have to keep going, and it gives you just the changes. But it's based on SQL Server change tracking. But how do I enable it? How do I use it in code? It's typically used for integrations. How do I use alternate keys? And how do I use the upsert method? So all the things if I'm doing integration with Dataverse to another system, both pulling and pushing. This is what this is really about, data. So what resources? So hopefully you've got that's a really fast run through. Hopefully I haven't scared you too much, but it just gives you an idea, maybe things you don't know about. So how do you prepare? This again is another Microsoft page that I stole. We have Microsoft Learning. There's instructor-led training. I deliver the instructor-led training on this. I've been delivering CRM and Power Apps developer training for 10 years now, in one way or another. But for me, you need to actually have done things. It's not, you can't do this as a theoretical. You've got to have strong applied knowledge. You must go in and build stuff. So let's have a look at what we've got. Measure Up. There is a practice coming to Measure Up. Measure Up is Microsoft's only official practice test. There will be one for PL-400. I don't think it's there now, but it's in development, or will be later this year. Microsoft just pushed some other things ahead of it, security ones. So what we have is the Microsoft Learn material. I'll put this link in the chat. If I go get it. So this is my collection of all the Learn modules that you can use. Right, so we can be able to, will these slides be available later? You're gonna have somewhere, or shall I put, I'll make them available and post them on my Twitter feed so everybody can grab them. Yeah, I'll do that rather than just try and post them all here. But I'll post you this one. This is where you go get the Learn material. Now the Learn material is pretty good. It doesn't cover, the trouble is it doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover it covers most, but doesn't go into enough detail. It's really just about the facts. And it doesn't give you that extra bit of knowledge that you get from instructor-led training. But it's a good start. And for instance, the introduction to developers, I put it in this order. This is the order you should do it in my collection, rather than what Microsoft give you. Just go to Learn and search for it. You need to understand the resources you've got. You need to understand Dataverse for developers. This module here, Dataverse developers, is the most important module. You need to understand how it all fits together and the tools there. Yeah, this is what there is on Learn. There's a lot of there's a lot there if you actually go through it. The portals is probably a bit much. There is a bit of portals in it, but not much. So that last one isn't really that relevant. It probably goes into a bit too much depth. There is a bit of portals in the exam, but not fully. And some of these don't. The component framework one is reasonably good as an introduction, but doesn't necessarily go into enough detail. And the Mr. Power Apps portals you don't need. It shouldn't be there. But I think what they did is said, what have we got in Learn already? Let's throw it in. We need to add some more in. There are some gaps, and that's what I'm trying to tell you about Learn. Right, some blogs. Joe Griffin. Joe is a UK MVP. He is a developer. And I actually trained Joe in developing. He came on one of my courses about 7-8 years ago, and he's gone on and he writes really good. So he's got two things. He's got his blog. He's actually blogging on this exam. So he was probably, I would go, my primary source. He's not finished yet. It's an ongoing project. He probably does a post a week on this, trying to attach one of those topics. So go look at him. He's also recording videos. So I'm going to put all these links in the chat for you. So you can just grab them now if you want, rather than trying to write them, because they are a bit long. The CM Ninja EY, he is. So I'm gonna have to. The only thing about Teams is it doesn't allow you to copy and paste nicely. EY CM Ninja, he's just done like a summary of the exam, what's in it, what he exposed. Like for instance, I think what his experience was. So that's pretty good knowledge. And April Dunham's done like an intro video just to give you an overview of the exam. But for me, Joe is your primary resource for video. Somebody asked about videos. Joe's video channel's got quite a few on there. As he's posting, I think he's for every blog post he's doing a video for it as well. It's nice, a really, really, really good resource to use. And then get hands-on. There are Power App samples, and in those samples there are samples for writing code against Dataverse. There's also the Microsoft Docs for sample data, where you get samples using the web API or the client-side JavaScript. So those are there. So it is my mantra about getting hands-on. It's really, really important. And then there's the Microsoft Docs, and the docs for a developer are spread out. They're not just in one place, which I think is annoying. There's one for Power Apps. There's one for so effectively there's one for Canvas apps. There's one for the first one is actually for Dataverse. That's your Dataverse developers. So that's your plugins. That's your server side thing. Your second one is the sort of user interface around model-driven apps, and the third one is developer for a Canvas apps perspective. Right, let's do some questions now. Let's go. I'm going to just scroll up and have a look at the questions, see if there's any. I know I've seen a lot scroll up, which is why I haven't actually answered them. So let me just go through them. I think I've answered some. So somebody asked about limits, number of Excel records. Okay, this is about delegation. You can change the number of records it retrieves. So you need to understand the concept of delegation, what happens with that. And you can change how many it retrieves. It's in the property of a Canvas app. You can reduce it down, but it often depends on the connector. So often it is 2,000 records in a Canvas, but there's different. Excel and model is different. Virtual entity and connector, you need to figure that out. You need to read on that. Virtual entity versus connector, it's too long a subject for there. SQL Server DB connector for virtual tables. Okay. I don't know, but build is next week. There are always announcements. So yes, we'll do. Hopefully, it'll be soon. Susan, is there a specific exam for design and techniques? No, there isn't, because it's really hard to write exams that are on subjective topics like design and techniques. Like how do I do this, or best practice. None of the questions you will see in the exam are best practice. Because they have to be completely 100% right or 100% wrong. So Microsoft do not do exams on design or techniques. Probably the closest one is the PL-400, which is Solution Architect, which does stray into that territory because it is about sort of scenarios when you do one thing over another. So the answer would be Solution Architect, the PL-400. I think I've answered some of those. Somebody else has been answering. Somebody else has been thanking the limits for me. That's good. 500 items. I'm putting some good links on that. Okay. Is anybody else? Okay. NFC and NFC tags. Oh, crikey. I don't know. Yes, I have no idea about reading and writing NFC tags. Microsoft will have to enable that. They give us access to things like latitude and longitude and the compass. I'm not sure about NFC tags. That would be interesting. I do actually know one of my friends is an engineer, and his business is actually he builds solutions around NFC, but he writes his own code for that. He doesn't use a Power Platform. He does RFID and NFC tags, and like for instance, he's written a solution that tracks how railway carriages move around the railway network in the UK. So it's quite cool. Oh, thank you, Jagger, about my book. Okay, motivation. It's all about, hopefully here, that's what I'm trying to do. Links for the samples. Yes, I shall put those in the chat for you right now, and the docs as well. So I'll put those right now in the chat. Where we go, grab them. Copy the link. Chat, let's do that. My Twitter handle is @JulianDynamics. So I've done the samples, and I'll put these links to the Microsoft documentation in as well. If anybody has any other, oh, there we go. Where are we? So anybody, I'm not going to give a specific answer to the questions. I am going to share. I'm going to share my sort of slides on the blog. I'll put my slides, make them public. I'll tweet them and put them on my blog after this session. Yeah, I've got the links. So anybody else got any questions? So I'm just saying if I've not missed any. Can we integrate or fetch data from Tableau or data source in the Canvas app? Oh, I don't know. Not directly. There's no connector as far as I'm aware. You'd have to do something else for that. Maybe write your own custom connector. Maybe I know we can get data maybe from Power BI. I can get it in, and then we can maybe do something else. But that gets a bit around the houses. Yeah, Julian. Yeah, CDS. Yeah. Yeah, I changed it to Julian Dynamics years ago, and it's like RAS is RAS Dynamics. We're not going to change it now. Everybody knows who we are. Okay, my blog, I'll put it in. That's my blog URL. Again, I started my blog in 2005, I think, so it's been going quite a while. I don't really post that much on it, mainly on LinkedIn. Okay, has anybody else got any questions? If not, I just want to remind you, you can get my book and Danisha's book from Pact. It is currently 35% off, which is a good deal. I'll post the links in for both mine and his books, if I can find my page again. So post both those links in. The code is 35Power. And Pact are one of the sponsors today. They sponsor quite a few of the 365, the Power Community events. I think they pretty much sponsor all of them. And they're really committed to creating solutions for developers. That's really their focus on terms of the books they produce. So if you, for instance, I've got a book right now on. There's a book about to come out on project operations as well. So if you're into Dynamics 365 project operations, I'm reviewing that as well right now. So those books there. Oh, I've got access to the chat again in the session. Best way to translate from citizen dev to dev. Ooh, right. That actually brings me to my next slide. This stuff. Microsoft is just. They'll be talking about this next week at what is it next week? Build is Microsoft's developers conference, and they come up with this concept of fusion dev. It's about citizen developers and professional developers working together, and they've published an ebook for it, and they also publish it all on GitHub, including their sample code. And it's really, this is really, if I was looking at this now, looking to get into dev, this is what I'd be focusing on. Again, it's going to things like Azure Functions and using those with the Power Platform. So this is very much the way forward, how Microsoft is thinking about how we should work. So I'm going to put these links in the chat. This is the Fusion Dev stuff. It's quite good. It's got the samples are there. You can work through the book and create. If you work through it as a citizen dev, you'll be able to do a whole load of new things around there. I tried to gather all the all the links there for you. So that was a good question. Thanks, Gulshan. Sorry, any more questions? Or we've got a few more minutes. We've got a few more minutes left. But for me, the key thing for me when you look as a developer, this is why I think a Power Platform developer is different from maybe your classic developer who just writes code in, say, C# or React or something like that. The Power Platform developer needs a wide variety of skills. They need the back end and the front end. They need the low code as well as the code first, because you're working within a framework defined by the Power Platform. You don't have free rein to do anything. I mean, PCF allows you to get into modern web development with React, and if you're into that sort of thing. But there's so much more as a developer you'll be asked to do, which is why I think some what I call traditional developers don't like the Power Platform because they feel constrained. But for people like myself who aren't a full-time developer, I can go and create some really great solutions for my users just with a little bit of code, because I can do that. I can do that a little bit more than my functional consultants do. I can go build these components or PCF components, or know about PCF and where to go get them. Go to the PCF gallery and download a few and maybe make some changes, or just use the ones that are there to really create great solutions. Maybe to be able to write an Azure function or two, because Azure functions actually they sound scary, but they're actually not that hard. And just to remind you, can you give your feedback, please? The link's in the chat. May have got lost in what I've posted, but if there are no more questions, I'll say thank you. And I think it's Andrew's on next time. Okay, that's a really good question. So I'll finish up. That's a really good question. For me, it's been interesting because I always said you have to be in a new technology changes every 5 years. And when I started in my career, I was pretty much changing completely every 5 years. So when I started on Dynamics, I'm still doing what I was doing 18 years ago. I started in 2003, so 17, 18 years ago. And I'm pretty much doing the same thing. It's changed a lot during that time. So how do I see it in the Power Platform? I see AI being really important within the Power Platform. Be able to add AI easily into your apps. I've actually done a thing recently with this. I've been trialing bringing in AI, my own machine learning model, and using it in AI Builder. I see much more. I see Dataverse as being the center of the world, the center of your business world, using things like virtual tables to connect to multiple data sources to bring data and do that, create great solutions on top. Oh yeah. The AI 900 book is the AI book I'm writing right now. It'll be out in July. I'm meant to be finishing the final chapter this weekend, but I'm a little bit behind. So the AI 900 fundamentals, that's a Microsoft Press book I'm writing on AI fundamentals. AI is really, I think, where I see the future. So that's why I wrote that book, and I'm writing some other. I'm going to be writing some other things on using AI within it. So AI. If you ask me, where we're going to be 5 years, Dataverse, the center of the world, will have a very much more converged app solution. You won't just have to build the difference between canvas and model will completely disappear. You'll be basically it'll be easy to write apps, but there'll be a lot more pro developer stuff. You'll be able to really get into using Azure services together. For instance, I do stuff now with IoT and canvas apps, but it's hard work right now. I have to do a lot of what I call plumbing. The way Microsoft is going, that's all going to become a lot simpler just to stitch things together. For instance, I do a lot of Azure solution architecture. How do I link Azure services together? Using those in the Power Platform is going to become so much easier. And a good way to look at it is look where Microsoft is going in Azure, because a lot of what happens in Azure ends up being in the Power Platform, like AI Builder. If you follow the Microsoft AI people, you can see when something gets released in Microsoft Azure AI, it makes its way into AI Builder eventually. So always keep an eye on what Microsoft is doing with Azure. You can sort of predict what's coming, but AI is going to be the big thing. Okay. Sorry, I went on a bit long. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll see you again in an hour.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much. I'm gonna stop the recording. There was a lot of very useful information. Thanks a lot.
Okay.